the great misunderstanding when discard is read backwards. Most people summarize the end of a narcissistic relationship with one sentence that feels like a final judgment. They discarded me. Those words land with weight. They carry humiliation. They imply defeat. They suggest that a decision was made somewhere, a verdict was delivered, and you were found lacking. That interpretation wounds deeply because it places authority in the hands of someone who never truly possessed it. To say they discarded me assumes the narcissist was the one entitled to decide who stays and who goes, who matters and who does not. It frames the ending as a personal rejection rather than a structural interruption. And once that assumption takes root, everything that follows is filtered through shame instead of truth. But many relationships do not end because one person wakes up and chooses to leave. They end because continuation would require something far more dangerous: God's silence. Silence, at a certain point, is no longer patience. It becomes permission, and permission, when harm is ongoing, becomes complicity. There comes a moment when allowing something to persist would mean endorsing its damage, when restraint is no longer mercy but negligence, when intervention is no longer optional but necessary. That is the moment most people misread as rejection. The narcissist did not walk away because they were finished with you. They walked away because the arrangement itself lost authorization to continue. What looked like abandonment on the surface was, in truth, a removal beneath it. What appeared as disappearance was actually displacement. They were not expressing freedom. They were losing access. And once you begin to see that distinction, the entire narrative shifts. The story can no longer be told as "I was left" or "I was replaced." The question quietly but decisively changes from "Why did they leave?" to something far more unsettling and far more clarifying. Why were they no longer allowed to stay? That question does not flatter the ego. It does not offer quick comfort, but it opens a door. Most people were never taught to walk through a door that leads away from humiliation and towards something much closer to protection, even if it did not feel that way at the time. And once that door is opened, the idea of abandonment begins to collapse under the weight of a very different truth. You were not abandoned, you were protected. After the separation, a single interpretation often settles into the heart with quiet authority. I was abandoned, not loudly, not dramatically, but steadily, until it begins to shape how you remember everything that came before. Abandonment feels personal. It suggests failure. It implies that if you had been more valuable, more accommodating, more patient, the ending would not have come. And for many people shaped by faith, that interpretation cuts even deeper, because endurance was never optional for you. You were taught to remain, to forgive, to absorb, and to pray longer when things became difficult. And that is precisely why this situation required intervention. Many of you listening would have stayed, not because the relationship was healthy, but because leaving felt like betrayal of your values. You did not tolerate harm because you were blind. You tolerated it because you believed loyalty was righteous and perseverance was holy. You learned to spiritualize what should have been confronted and to reinterpret mistreatment as a test of character rather than a warning of danger. That strength, left unchecked, becomes a liability. Narcissistic relationships do not destroy people through sudden catastrophe. They do it through slow erosion, through repeated justifications, through the steady normalization of confusion. Over time, clarity dulls, boundaries soften, and the extraordinary begins to feel ordinary. What once would have alarmed you becomes something you manage instead. Left to your own reasoning, you would have continued adjusting. You would have explained their behavior, absorbed the damage, and postponed truth, in the hope that patience might eventually be rewarded, not because you were weak, but because you were faithful. And that is where protection enters not as comfort, but as restraint. The narcissist did not leave because they suddenly recognized your worth. They left because remaining would have required God to watch you diminish further. There comes a point when allowing harm to continue is no longer patience, it becomes negligence, when silence is no longer neutral but permissive. God does not confuse your ability to endure with your obligation to suffer. If you look back honestly, you may notice something unsettling about the timing. The separation did not occur when you were strongest. It happened when your discernment was thinning, when exhaustion had begun to masquerade as peace, when confusion felt permanent rather than temporary. That timing was not accidental. What appeared to be abandonment was actually containment. The narcissist was removed because your endurance was being mistaken for consent, because your compassion was being exploited, because the cost of allowing the relationship to continue was no longer measured in arguments or disappointment, but in the gradual loss of yourself. If you are listening to this and something within you recognizes the truth, not emotionally, but soberly, then write this in the comments. God protected me, not to announce healing, not to declare victory, but to acknowledge that protection sometimes arrives without asking whether we are ready to accept it. Protection is rarely gentle when gentleness has already been abused. Sometimes it is abrupt, sometimes it feels unjust, sometimes it comes without explanation, but it is never careless. And once you begin to accept that you were protected rather than abandoned, the story shifts again, because protection implies intention, and intention implies that what followed was not random, but necessary. And it is precisely at that point that divine intervention becomes necessary. Why God allows the narcissist to enter but never to stay. One of the hardest truths for a believing mind to accept is that not every harmful presence arrives by accident. Some are permitted not as rewards, not as endorsements, but as revelations. The entrance of a narcissist into your life was not a mistake in judgment. It was a moment of exposure. Exposure of patterns you did not yet see, boundaries you had not yet learned to guard, and a compassion that without discernment could be turned against you. God sometimes allows proximity so that clarity can be forged. Not all lessons are learned through instruction. Some are learned through contact. The narcissist entered because there were truths that could not be taught abstractly, truths about manipulation, entitlement, and the quiet ways goodness can be exploited. But permission to enter is not permission to remain. Their presence came with limits, even if those limits were invisible to you at the time. There was a window in which something different could have happened, a window where humility could have answered patience, where accountability could have followed grace, where repentance might have transformed what was destructive into something restrained. That window existed not because you were naive, but because mercy always allows room for change. But narcissism is not merely a failure of behavior. It is a refusal of responsibility. And when responsibility is consistently rejected, mercy does not expand indefinitely. It reaches a boundary. What many people misunderstand is this: God does not remove people because they are imperfect. He removes them because their continued presence would require the normalization of harm. There is a difference between weakness and willfulness, between stumbling and choosing not to see. The narcissist crossed that difference repeatedly. They were not cut off for one offense. They were removed because patterns solidified, because disrespect became routine, because distortion became strategy, because the cost of their presence was no longer a single wound, but a slow corrosion of your sense of truth. At that point, the relationship ceased to be instructive. It became obstructive. You were not meant to spend your life translating cruelty into context or confusion into compassion. You were not placed on this path to become an interpreter for someone else's refusal to change. When learning gives way to erosion, the purpose has already expired. This is why their exit often feels sudden, why there is no final conversation that satisfies, why understanding does not arrive on their lips. When a role has ended, explanation is not required. The lesson has already been completed. God allows entry to reveal. God enforces exit to preserve. And once preservation becomes the priority, the relationship no longer belongs to the realm of choice. It moves into the realm of necessity. The removal is not emotional. It is corrective, not punitive, but preventative, which explains why, after they are gone, a strange quiet begins to surface. Not relief yet, not peace, but space. Space where your thoughts are no longer intercepted, where your conscience no longer negotiates with contradiction, where the weight you had learned to carry begins to lift, not dramatically, but measurably. That space was not accidental. It was created. And as that space widens, it becomes increasingly clear that what followed was never about whether they would leave, but about when the threshold would finally be crossed, the moment when continuation itself would no longer be allowed. There comes a moment in certain relationships when the question is no longer whether things will change, but whether allowing them to continue would itself become an act of injustice. This is the moment most people never see clearly, because it does not announce itself with noise or explanation. It arrives quietly, decisively, and without negotiation. From the outside, it looks abrupt, a sudden silence, an unexpected withdrawal, a break that feels unfinished and unresolved. But what appears sudden to you is often the final movement of a process that has been unfolding for far longer than you realized. The narcissist did not leave because they won. They did not leave because they gained clarity, and they did not leave because they suddenly lost interest. They left because the role they were occupying in your life reached its limit. Their presence crossed from being permitted to being prohibited. This is where many people misunderstand divine action. They expect intervention to feel like comfort, explanation, or rescue. But when damage has already been normalized, intervention often comes as restriction. Access is revoked, proximity is severed, influence is removed. Enough is not an emotion. Enough is a threshold. And once that threshold is crossed, the question is no longer debated. The decision is not revisited. The relationship does not enter a repair phase. It simply ends, because allowing it to continue would require a kind of permission that can no longer be granted. This is why the narcissist's departure often feels cold, why there is no meaningful closure, why conversations end mid-sentence and explanations never arrive. Judicial removals are not relational discussions. They do not prioritize emotional understanding. They enforce boundaries that words can no longer sustain. The narcissist did not walk away with authority. They were displaced from a position they were no longer allowed to occupy. And that distinction matters, because it explains why the separation felt different from ordinary endings. There was no gradual fading, no mutual agreement, no sense of resolution. Instead, there was a sharp reordering, two paths diverging without ceremony, without reconciliation, without shared meaning. Once removed, they no longer walk beside you. They no longer shape your environment. They no longer participate in your internal negotiations. Their influence is cut off, not because you demanded it, but because continuation would have required your continued diminishment. This is also why attempts to make sense of the ending often fail. You search for a conversation that never happened, an explanation that was never given, a moment where everything could have been said clearly. But clarity was not delivered through dialogue, it was delivered through separation. The removal was the message. And while the narcissist may believe they chose the exit, their life following the separation often reveals otherwise. What follows is rarely expansion, rarely stability, rarely growth. The illusion of control may remain, but the substance begins to erode. The patterns repeat. The environments shrink. The same conflicts reappear under different names. Because removal is not relocation to something better. It is exclusion from what can no longer be harmed. For you, this moment marks a structural shift. Not healing yet, not understanding yet, but alignment. Something heavy has been lifted, even if you cannot yet name what it was. Something that required constant vigilance is no longer present. Something that demanded translation and tolerance is gone. And as that absence settles, another truth begins to surface, one that will take time to fully grasp. Because when someone is removed rather than released, it often means they were allowed to leave, believing they chose it. And that belief carries consequences of its own. When the narcissist is removed, something strange often happens next, something that confuses those who are watching closely. They appear to move on quickly. They seem confident. They speak as if they made a calculated choice, as if leaving you was an upgrade, a liberation, even a victory. To the outside world, it can look as though they escaped consequences and stepped into something better. This is not freedom. It is illusion. In moments of removal, the narcissist is often allowed to leave, carrying a false sense of control. They are permitted to believe the story that protects their ego, that they chose to walk away, that you were the problem, that the future ahead of them is brighter. This belief is not a reward, it is containment. Confronting reality too soon would collapse them entirely. Narcissism cannot survive honest self-examination. It depends on narrative control, on the ability to rewrite endings in a way that preserves superiority. So instead of immediate reckoning, they are allowed to walk forward under false assumptions, convinced they upgraded, convinced they outgrew you, convinced they lost nothing of value. But illusions are fragile things. They require constant reinforcement. The new supply becomes part of the story they tell themselves, not because the connection is deep, but because it serves a function. It validates the lie that leaving was progress. It reassures them that they are still admired, still desired, still powerful. Yet beneath that surface, the substance is thin, the connection lacks depth, the admiration lacks stability, and the same patterns that once operated in your relationship quietly reappear. Illusion delays judgment. It does not erase it. Over time, the cracks begin to show not publicly, but internally. The excitement fades. The novelty wears thin. The same emptiness resurfaces, because emptiness was never caused by you. The same conflicts repeat, because the problem was never circumstantial. What once felt like triumph begins to feel hollow. This is why narcissists rarely move forward. They repeat sideways. New faces, familiar outcomes, different names, identical dynamics. The illusion allows them to avoid accountability, but it cannot create transformation. For you, watching this can be disorienting. It may seem unfair that while you are left processing pain, they appear untouched. It may feel as though justice has been postponed indefinitely. But justice does not always arrive as exposure. Sometimes it arrives as permission to believe a lie long enough for its consequences to mature. The illusion they carry isolates them from truth. It prevents learning, it ensures repetition, and repetition over time becomes its own sentence. What they call winning is merely delay. They are not advancing, they are circling, and every circle tightens the distance between illusion and reckoning. The longer they believe the lie, the harder it becomes to escape it. Eventually, the narrative they rely on collapses under its own weight. And when that collapse begins, it does not start with remorse or insight. It starts with comparison, with memory, with the unsettling realization that something real was lost and replaced with something inferior. That is when the illusion turns unstable. That is when the story they told themselves can no longer hold, and that instability does not move outward. It turns back toward the one person they once believed they had outgrown, the awakening they cannot escape. Illusions do not shatter all at once. They thin, they weaken. They lose coherence in quiet moments when there is no audience to perform for and no narrative to reinforce. What begins as confidence slowly turns into restlessness. What once felt like certainty becomes comparison. This is the stage the narcissist never anticipates. At first, they dismiss the unease. They tell themselves it is temporary, circumstantial, caused by stress or boredom. But the unease persists because it is not situational, it is structural. The lie they relied on to leave you intact can only carry them so far before it begins to collapse under its own contradictions. They start to measure what they have against what they lost, not openly, not honestly, but compulsively. They replay conversations. They revisit moments of stability they once mocked. They remember how problems were contained rather than chaotic, how presence felt grounding rather than performative. The comparison is not flattering to their current reality, and that realization produces a pressure they do not know how to resolve. This is where awakening begins, not as repentance, but as disturbance. They do not suddenly understand you. They begin to miss the function you served, the regulation you provided, the consistency they exploited. They feel the absence of something they assumed was replaceable, and the discovery unsettles them because it contradicts the story they told themselves to justify leaving. The narcissist does not awaken to truth, they awaken to loss. And that loss feels intolerable, because narcissism cannot process deprivation without assigning blame. So rather than confronting their own role, they seek to restore access. This is when the hoovers appear, carefully timed messages, nostalgic references, vague apologies, sudden concern. Not accountability, not ownership, just enough ambiguity to test whether the door is still unlocked. These attempts are not driven by love. They are driven by destabilization. They reach out because the illusion is failing, because the new supply no longer sustains the narrative, because the sense of superiority that once insulated them has begun to erode. They are trying to re-anchor themselves to something familiar, something that once worked. What they do not realize is that the awakening they are experiencing is already too late. Time has passed. Distance has done its work, and the version of you that once tolerated confusion has been replaced by someone who recognizes patterns without explaining them away. You may not feel strong, you may not feel healed, but you are no longer accessible in the same way. The awakening the narcissist experiences is asymmetrical. They wake up to what they lost, just as you wake up to what you were spared. This mismatch creates desperation on their side and clarity on yours. The power dynamic reverses not through confrontation, but through absence. Not through argument, but through non-engagement. They feel the shift, even if they cannot name it. Something that once responded no longer does. And that non-response is not cruelty, it is consequence. Because awakening without accountability does not lead to restoration. It leads to frustration. And frustration, when unmet by access, forces a reckoning the narcissist has spent a lifetime avoiding. They cannot undo what has already been structurally altered. The separation was not emotional, it was architectural, which is why the next phase does not hinge on what they do, but on what you no longer permit. The final discard is not an event the narcissist initiates. It is a condition you enter. This is where most people misunderstand power. They assume power is loud, decisive, confrontational. They imagine closure as a dramatic moment where everything is said, truth is exposed, and justice is announced. But real power in these dynamics arrives quietly, almost invisibly, and it does not require explanation. The final discard happens when you are no longer reachable, not blocked in anger, not distant out of fear, but inaccessible by design. Up to this point, the narcissist's world has depended on response, reaction, engagement. Even pain still counts as connection. As long as you explained yourself, defended your intentions, or tried to clarify misunderstandings, the bond, however distorted, remained active. But something shifts when you stop translating yourself. You no longer correct their version of events. You no longer attempt to be understood. You no longer feel compelled to prove your goodness to someone committed to misunderstanding it. This is not bitterness. It is discernment. The narcissist experiences this shift as disappearance. One day, the familiar emotional doors simply do not open. The same tactics no longer produce the same effects. The hooks that once worked find no place to attach. And this is deeply destabilizing, because narcissism cannot tolerate irrelevance. They are not distressed because they love you. They are distressed because they cannot reach you. This is the point where the illusion of control finally breaks. Not because you confronted them, but because you removed yourself from the field where control could be exercised. They cannot argue with silence. They cannot dominate absence. They cannot manipulate what does not respond. The final discard is not rejection. It is non-participation, and it does something profound. It forces the narcissist to face themselves without a mirror that distorts reality in their favor. Without you to absorb blame, regulate chaos, or stabilize their emotions, they are left alone with patterns they cannot outrun. For you, this stage may feel anticlimactic. There is no dramatic relief, no emotional triumph. Often, there is simply a deep stillness, one that feels unfamiliar because your nervous system had grown accustomed to vigilance. You may question whether you are doing enough, whether you should say one last thing, whether silence is avoidance. It is not. Silence, at this stage, is alignment. You are no longer trying to resolve what was never mutual. You are no longer negotiating with someone who required you to disappear in order for them to feel whole. You are not withholding love. You are withdrawing access to what was being misused. This is where many people falter, because compassion tempts them to reopen doors that wisdom has already closed. The narcissist may reappear humbled, wounded, reflective. They may speak the language of insight without the substance of accountability. And the temptation will not be to return out of weakness, but out of empathy. But empathy without boundaries is how the cycle restarts. The final discard is sustained not by anger, but by clarity. By the sober recognition that some people do not lose access because they are misunderstood, but because they are unsafe to engage, not physically perhaps, but spiritually, psychologically, relationally. You do not announce this boundary, you embody it. And once embodied, it does not require maintenance through effort. It holds because it is rooted in truth rather than reaction. The narcissist senses this. They feel the permanence of it, even if they cannot articulate why. The door is not slammed, it is sealed. The blessing you couldn't see at the time. For a long while, it may not feel like a blessing at all, It may feel like loss without ceremony, like silence without explanation, like a chapter torn out instead of gently closed. And for people of faith, especially those who were taught that endurance is noble and sacrifice is holy, that kind of ending can feel deeply unsettling. But blessings are not always recognized by how they feel. They are recognized by what they prevent. Had the narcissist remained, the cost would not have been dramatic. It would have been gradual. You would not have woken up one day ruined. You would have woken up smaller, less certain, more cautious with your own thoughts, more willing to doubt yourself than to question what was harming you. That is how damage becomes permanent when it is slow enough to feel normal. The removal interrupted that trajectory. It did not immediately restore you. It did not instantly clarify everything. What it did was far more precise. It stopped the erosion. It returned you to a position where growth was once again possible, even if you were not yet ready to grow. It gave you space. Space not filled with noise, explanation, or performance, but with absence. And absence, when sustained, reveals what presence once concealed. This is where many people misunderstand divine judgment. They expect it to look like punishment, visible consequences, public downfall, obvious suffering. But judgment, in its truest form, is not about spectacle. It is about separation, about deciding what may continue and what may not. The narcissist was not removed to elevate you above them. They were removed to prevent further distortion. And that distinction matters, because it keeps you from measuring your healing against their decline. It keeps your focus where it belongs, not on watching them fall, but on understanding why they could not stay. Over time, you may notice something subtle but unmistakable. Your thoughts begin to feel like your own again. Decisions no longer require internal debate. Your sense of purpose, once fragmented by constant emotional management, starts to reassemble. Not dramatically, quietly, naturally. This is not triumph. It is alignment. You begin to realize that your life is no longer organized around someone else's instability. That your calling, whatever form it takes, requires clarity, integrity, and direction that could not coexist with manipulation. The narcissist was not simply a difficult chapter. They were a blockage. And when blockages are removed, movement resumes. You were not spared so that you could feel superior. You were spared so that you could become whole. That is why this story does not end with vengeance or validation. It ends with release, with the recognition that what you thought was rejection was actually preservation, and what you mourned as loss was the removal of something that would have kept you from becoming who you were meant to be. Some people leave because they choose to. Others leave because they are no longer permitted to remain. And once you understand the difference, you stop asking why they walked away and begin to understand why your path finally opened.